I'll do it afterwards.
Okay, I'll leave it here.
It'll dry out if we leave it without the top on.
A nome del comitato organizzatore di Festivaletteratura ringraziamo Tea per aver contribuito alla realizzazione di questo evento e diamo il benvenuto a Antony Beevor. Presenta Giovanni Zucca, Accenti.
Buonasera, ben ritrovati. Con questo incontro e quello che segue, la nostra rassegna Accenti prende una dimensione internazionale che il festival ha naturalmente, nel senso che entrambi questi incontri non sono in lingua originale. Il professor Beevor parlerà in inglese, non c'è traduzione, e successivamente il prossimo in spagnolo, analogamente senza traduzione. Lo segnalo unicamente per correttezza. Allora, Antony Beevor è visiting professor di storia all'Università di Londra, è un storico di chiara fama, come si dice, allievo di John Keegan, uno dei maestri della storiografia della Seconda Guerra Mondiale, è stato ufficiale degli Ussari e ha scritto libri di grandissimo successo sulla battaglia di Stalingrado, sulla caduta di Berlino e sulla guerra civile spagnola. Ci parlerà questa sera di un libro di cui è stato curatore, degli scritti di guerra di Vasily Grossman, grande scrittore russo, autore tra l'altro di Vita e Destino. Please, Professor Beevor, 30 minutes for you.
My apologies about not speaking in Italian, but anyway. Many critics, including George Steiner, have hailed Vasily Grossman's great novel Life and Fate as one of the major works of fiction of the 20th century. And perhaps even more than that. It's certainly the most important Russian novel of the Stalinist age and of what Osip Mandelstam called the Wolfhound century. As the title, Life and Fate, suggests, this deliberate homage to Tolstoy was also an epic novel, only in this case involving the Battle of Stalingrad instead of the Battle of Borodino. Mixed in with the different families in the story are even a few real characters, as in Life and Fate. And there is even Stalin himself, who makes a midnight telephone call to Viktor Strum, the physicist. And this is based on Ilya Ehrenberg's experience, and he was a great friend of Grossman's, who was rung up suddenly by Stalin in the middle of the night. A very terrifying experience for anybody, I'm sure. A writer of war is basically a collection of the raw material of Vasily Grossman's most important writing during the Second World War, the defining period of his life. Most of the excerpts come from his notebooks, and these he kept even though it was extraordinarily dangerous, because Grossman was one of the most honest, in fact probably the only really honest journalist covering the war on the Eastern Front. In 1994, when I began researching Stalingrad, I had, of course, read Life and Fate. But I had no idea, or very little idea, about Grossman and his life. And when we started work in the archives, we went to the Russian State Archive of Literature and the Arts. And there we found many of Grossman's papers. Now, one has to remember that the bulk of his papers had all been confiscated, or rather arrested, by the KGB in 1961. And this was when Grossman, perhaps rather naively, had thought that with the thaw under Khrushchev, he could publish his life's work, his great masterpiece. And the trouble was that he had underestimated basically the commitment that many of the senior Soviet nomenclatura had made to Stalinism, even though they had now turned against it. And when the novel was actually shown to Mikhail Suslov, who was the cultural chief on the Central Committee, Suslov was so appalled, because this was the very first work which had in any way made a comparison between Nazism and communism, Stalinism. And Suslov came up with the remark saying, this book should not be published for 200 years. This is perhaps the greatest compliment that's ever been paid to any novel in its own particular way. Grossman's wartime notes, when he was a war correspondent at the front, were written in these tiny little notebooks with squared paper, rather like a child's exercise book. And how Luba Vinogradova, my wonderful Russian colleague who I've worked with for over 20 years, was able to decipher many of them because the writing was so tiny, I just don't know. But it soon became clear that Grossman had used all of these notes, not just for his journalism, which was very famous in Russia, because he was writing for Krasnaya Zvezda, which was the Red Army newspaper, but everybody read it. It was not just the army. And in fact, Stalin read it the most carefully of all. He read every single page, which prompted Ilya Ehrenberg to joke that, in fact, Stalin was his most devoted reader. But it also became rapidly important, rapidly clear how important these notes were because of the way they actually described the real reality of what fighting on the Eastern Front was like. Grossman spent longer there than any other journalist, and his unparalleled powers of observation and his extraordinary intellectual honesty in an age when it carried a death sentence constitute a really a very important document. Grossman's technique as a war correspondent were totally different to those of his colleagues. He once ridiculed the grotesque propaganda stories churned out by the worst sort of Soviet hack journalist. And when he talked about articles recounting how Private Ivan Pupkin killed 20 Germans with a spoon. Well, even the work of famous wartime writers like Ehrenberg and Konstantin Simonov did not really live up to anything that Grossman himself wrote. The soldiers at the front also trusted him because his novel, The People Immortal, which was published in sections in Krasnaya Zvezda during the spring of 1942, was the only honest account of the disastrous retreat in 1941, for which, of course, Stalin was largely responsible. And so, not surprisingly, Stalin made sure that Grossman's name was struck off the list of those, in fact, he was regarded as the most likely winner of the Stalin Prize for Literature. Well, Stalin certainly wasn't going to allow him to win that prize which bore his name. Anyway, the effect, though, of this novel was the way that the soldiers and the officers greeted Grossman as a sort of hero because they realized what he wrote was true. And what is striking, in fact, is Grossman, who was so obviously fairly unfit and flabby, a Jewish intellectual from Moscow, exactly the sort of person who most Soviet soldiers might have hated at the time. But they trusted him, and they trusted him completely. Some 4 years later, when Luba and I worked on his papers, covering the archives, including the advance to Berlin, on which Grossman did not ignore the crimes committed by the Red Army. And this was another reason why those notebooks were so powerful, because, again, he described everything that he saw, including some of the mass rapes and the killings. And he, in fact, was risking being sent to the Gulag if the NKVD or Smersh had happened to have found those notebooks. And in fact, Ottenberg, who was the editor of Krasnaya Zvezda, was horrified when he found that Grossman had been keeping notes and a diary all through, because he realized what a danger he was putting himself in. But once again, it was almost as if Grossman's innocence and naivety had somehow protected him. Well, the reason why, in fact, this book was written was because I mentioned these notebooks to Christopher MacLehose, who was the publisher at Harville, who was the first to publish Life and Fate in English. And he begged me, he said, listen, please, this is so important, it must come out. And also, it was of good, wonderful use, if you like, to Grossman's family, who'd been left absolutely penniless when he died, and they had absolutely nothing. In fact, it also, fortunately, provoked the republication, or in some cases even the publication in many European countries, of Life and Fate, which had often been overlooked. Vasily Grossman, I must go back and do a little bit of his life, was born in Ukraine, in the town of Berdichev, in 1905. Berdichev was one of the largest Jewish populations in Central Europe. and the Grossmans were part of an educated elite. Up until the Nazi invasion and the murder of his mother in Berdichev, Grossman, rather like Ilya Ehrenberg, had never really thought of himself as Jewish. He thought himself entirely as Russian. Grossman's parents separated, and as a young boy, he lived for some time in Switzerland with his mother just before the First World War. But after the revolution, when they'd returned to Russia, he was in Berdichev. And this was at a time when the Ukraine was occupied by the Germans under Field Marshal von Eichhorn, when the Germans at the end of the First World War were starving. And they wanted to take all of the grain and the food from Ukraine to feed Germany. And then, as the Kaiser's armies withdrew in November 1918, the Russian Civil War broke out in earnest, with fighting between the White Armies, the Red Army, Ukrainian nationalists, and even anarchist forces. And in some cases, Red Army Guards vented their blind hatred, and so did some of the nationalists. And already some 150,000 Jews were killed in pogroms during that period of the Civil War. Famine followed in 1920 and 1922, but not as bad as what was to come later. Grossman then went to Moscow University in 1923, where he studied chemistry, and he started, even at that stage, when he was very unmilitary, to have a fascination in military affairs, which was rather paradoxical. But anyway, he decided soon that he didn't want to really continue his life as a scientist and engineer, and he was working, in fact, in Donetsk, in the Donbass, the scene of recent fighting, and returned to Moscow, where he started to write. And one has to remember, though, in 1932, 10 years after the end of the Civil War, an even worse man-made famine started when Stalin decided to enforce rapid collectivization. And this led to a famine with estimates of the figures, the Holodomor, which is anything between 4 million and 7 million died of famine during that particular period. Parents crazed by hunger even ate their own children. If Grossman did not witness all of the worst horrors of this particular famine, he certainly heard of them, and he saw the results as skeletal figures begged behind railway tracks, hoping that passengers might throw them a crust of bread or something like that. And he later described this terrible Ukrainian famine in his last novel, Forever Flowing, including the execution of a woman accused of eating her 2 children. The consequences of Stalin's sadistic treatment of Ukraine, as Grossman himself was to discover, would be the widespread Ukrainian welcome to invading German forces a decade later. Stalinist agents were said to have spread the rumor that the Jews had been responsible for the famine. And this may well have been a factor later in the Ukrainians' enthusiastic aid to the Germans in the massacre of Jews. In 1932, the same year as the Ukrainian famine, Grossman left his post in Stalino and then moved back to Moscow, where he was writing, and he started his first novel, Stepan Kolchugin. And a short story, In the Town of Berdichev, published in April 1934, brought great praise from Mikhail Bulgakov, Maxim Gorky, who was then the grand old man of Soviet letters. Although Gorky himself was rather suspicious of Grossman's failure to embrace socialist realism. But nevertheless, he still supported the young writer's work. Now, in March 1933, Grossman's cousin, Nadezhda Almaz, was arrested for Trotskyism. And Grossman himself was arrested by the OGPU, which later became the NKVD secret police. And he, in fact, was extremely fortunate. And once again, somehow, some sort of guardian angel seems to have been watching over Grossman. And he just avoided that. If this had happened about 3 years later during the Great Terror, he wouldn't have stood a chance. But life for a writer was certainly not easy during this particular time. I mean, it was a miracle, as I say, that Grossman could have survived the purges, which Ilya Ehrenberg himself described as a lottery. Ehrenberg was well aware of Grossman's gauche and ingenuous nature. He said, "He was extremely kind and a devoted friend," Ehrenberg wrote. "He could sometimes say, giggling to a 50-year-old woman, 'You have aged a lot in the last month.' I knew about this trait in him and did not get offended when he would suddenly remark, 'You started to write so badly for some reason.'" In 1935, when Grossman's first marriage had been over for a few years, he began a relationship with Olga Mikhailovna Gubna, a large woman 5 years his senior. She was married to Fedor Guba, a fellow writer, and he very generously realized that his wife had fallen completely in love with Grossman, and he didn't therefore try to stop her leaving or anything like that. But Guba, coming of German ancestry, found himself soon arrested, and he was executed in 1937 during the Great Terror. That year, Grossman himself actually became a member of the Writers' Union, which was an official seal of approval, and it provided many perks. But then his wife was arrested, and Grossman, with extraordinary courage, actually went to see the head of the NKVD himself, and somehow managed to persuade him that she was not responsible in any way or involved in her husband's crimes, which actually were invented. And she was released. But once again, it was an extraordinary testament to his moral courage. It was a time of profound humiliation for most writers. Even Grossman had to sign a document supporting the trial of the old Bolsheviks when they were accused of Trotskyist fascist treason. And he never forgot the horrors of that particular time, and he used a lot of it in the novel, in Life and Fate. But the worst of the terror seemed to have passed when the pact with Hitler was made in 1939. And in 1941, Grossman was able to spend that summer on the Black Sea, early in that summer, with his wife. And then suddenly, though, of course, the German invasion started in June, and they had to get back to Moscow quickly. And this was one of the most traumatic moments in Grossman's life, because his mother was still in Berdichev, and they didn't realize the speed of the German advance and the way that Berdichev was one of the main targets for that German attack. And they, by the time he'd realized, it was too late to go down to rescue his mother. And for the rest of his life, he would never be able to forgive himself for the fact that, of course, she ended up with all of the other Jews in the first major massacre before the massacre at Babi Yar outside Kiev. And once again, all of these personal experiences played a large part in his own experience. And one sees this even in Life and Fate, where Victor Sturm is traumatized by his own inability to have rescued his mother. That comes in the novel. But these notebooks here, they begin really in August 1941, when Grossman was sent to the front by Ortenberg, the editor of Krasnaya Zvezda, of Red Star. And Ortenberg, though, was worried that Grossman would not survive the rigors of the front. I mean, he was even walking on a stick, he was overweight, and he looked much older than his real age. And he even made Grossman do some sort of military training beforehand. But what was far more important were Grossman's qualities as a war correspondent. And this came from his constant observation and his natural humanity. Unlike other Soviet writers, his work was never distorted by the party line. Anyway, I'll tell you about myself, he wrote to his father in February of 1942. I've been almost constantly on the move for the last 2 months. There are days when one sees more than in 10 years of peace. I've become thin now. I've become an experienced frontovic. I can tell immediately by the sounds of explosion what is happening and where. And Grossman had indeed slimmed down. He'd also become fit. He'd also learned to shoot. And in fact, he was thrilled when he beat everybody else at pistol shooting. He'd been studying military tactics and military theory. But of course, he was also fascinated by soldiers' language, and particularly the slang. But above all, he demonstrated extraordinary physical courage as well as the moral courage that he had. And actually, moral courage and physical courage very seldom occur in the same person. It's amazing how very brave men physically can often be terrible moral cowards. But Grossman showed both. And even though he was so obviously a member of the Jewish intelligentsia, the soldiers, because of his writing, trusted him completely. In Stalingrad, for example, he got to know Chekhov, who was the top-scoring sniper in the 62nd Army. And no sniper normally would have ever allowed any journalist near them, but he trusted Grossman so much that Grossman was even able to accompany him in camouflage to his killing lair and described how he shot one German after another with his sniper's rifle. Unlike most Soviet journalists eager to quote politically correct cliches, Grossman was exceptionally patient in his interviewing techniques. He relied, as he explained later on, with talks with soldiers withdrawn for short breaks. The soldier tells you everything he has on his mind. One does not even need to ask questions. And Grossman was not a dispassionate observer, but the power of his writing came entirely from his own emotional response, partly to the humiliation of 1941 and also to the desperate battles of 1942, which culminated at Stalingrad. And his technique of walking away after having talked to these soldiers, and then he would go straight back to where the journalists and the correspondents were sleeping in some sort of peasant hut in Izba. He wouldn't go to sleep. He would just simply be writing down very rapidly all of his notes. And Altenburg, when he saw his technique, was extremely impressed. He'd been present during these worst periods of 1941 during the retreat, along with the destruction of Gomel, which is described here. He'd then very nearly been captured when Guderian's 2nd Panzer Army swung round and enveloped, in fact, in one of the biggest defeats ever made in military history, when 600,000 Soviet prisoners were taken in Kiev and around Kiev. Grossman only just managed to escape and get out. He had other very near escapes in the front. And especially, for example, in the following October, that is still in 1941, when General Petrov's 50th Army was surrounded, Grossman managed to get out just before the Germans arrived. And similarly, he nearly drove straight into a German ambush during that particular winter. In that late winter of 1941 and the early part of 1942, when the Germans were halted outside Moscow, Grossman covered the fighting further on south on the eastern edge of Ukraine. But his real moment came in August 1942 as the German Sixth Army advanced on Stalingrad. And Grossman was there almost the whole time. But then, rather for political reasons, because Grossman was not trusted by the authorities, although he was trusted by Altenburg, Altenburg was forced to withdraw him when it came to the great victory at Stalingrad. And that had to be covered by Simonov, who was famous and was also a sort of a favorite of Stalin's. Because Stalin would not have liked to have had Grossman, partly maybe also because Grossman was Jewish, and one was well aware of Stalin's latent anti-Semitism. But for Grossman anyway, the Battle of Stalingrad was undoubtedly one of his most important experiences in life, and that is also why it constitutes really the center of the great novel of Life and Fate. And in it, you will see that the Volga is much more than even just a symbolic thread for the whole book. It is the main artery of Russia pumping its lifeblood into the defense at Stalingrad. Grossman, like many fellow idealists, believed passionately that the heroism of the Red Army at Stalingrad would not just win the war. It would change Soviet society forever. Once victory over the Nazis had been won, then surely there would be no need for the NKVD, for all of the trials and the show trials against so-called traitors and Trotskyist fascist infiltrators and so forth, which had been the paranoia before the war. But of course, he was wrong. As the war ended, Stalin became more and more afraid that as the Soviet armies reached foreign territory, they would be corrupted by the very fact of being on foreign territory. I mean, he was the archetypal xenophobe in that particular sense. But also because the soldiers, when they arrived, even in East Prussia and in Germany, were astonished at the living conditions, of how good the living conditions were, even for ordinary workers. And they started to be aware of the lies that they'd been told, that the Soviet Union was the paradise for all workers. And certainly Smash and the NKVD started to get increasingly paranoid about letters home to families when people were saying, why did the Germans invade us when they lived such a far more comfortable life than we ever lived? I think Grossman also wanted to describe all of this dishonesty, if you like, in Soviet life through the reactions of Krimov, a commissar. And he describes this in tremendous detail, both if you like, the determined idealism of the genuine communist and the opportunism of those in the nomenclatura who were only interested in their own advancement. Grossman was also present at the Battle of Kursk, which was the great tank battle in July 1943. 5 minutes? But the most, for him, the most traumatic, in fact, was, of course, the slaughter of Jews in the Ukraine, partly for the reasons of his mother's death at Berdichev, but also because Grossman instinctively saw that the criminality of the Nazi reaction had been to try to annihilate the individuality of their victims. And in his writing, Grossman was quite brilliant in the way that he tried to rebuild the humanity of people, even if he didn't know their names or anything about them, but of rebuilding the Jewish society which had existed, which had been destroyed so devastatingly, by describing the different professions, whether a professor of cardiac professor, or even a tinsmith, or any form of ordinary worker. And he did this quite brilliantly in that particular way, because then later, when he was with the 62nd Army, the great army from Stalingrad, he was present at Treblinka when they occupied that. And that was, again, one of his most important pieces of writing, when he managed to reconstruct what the Nazis had actually done at Treblinka, how they'd done it. And this was actually used at the Nuremberg Tribunal. It was the only piece of evidence offered on the Holocaust at the Nuremberg Tribunal. And the reason for this was that Stalin, once again, was against it. Stalin did not want the Jews to be seen as a special category of suffering. His slogan was, "Do not divide the dead," i.e. all of the victims had to be seen as Soviet citizens, not as Jews at all. And Ilya Ehrenberg, Jewish himself, realized the danger when he and Grossman were working on something called the Black Book, which was a catalogue of the Nazi crimes against the Jews, because this was now totally against the party line. And in fact, some of them involved, some of the Jewish leaders involved in the Soviet Anti-Fascist Committee were then murdered by the KGB. In subsequent years. And Grossman himself was very lucky that Stalin had died when he did in 1953, because he might well have been one of the next to go, because this was the time of the Jewish doctor's plot and all the rest of it. But anyway, to leave it there, I think the important thing is these particular descriptions, which he recorded himself at the time, not only give this extraordinary, unique description of what the Eastern Front was like in the Second World War. As I say, I think it's a lesson to any writer on observation, the importance of observation, the importance of empathy. And also, it is the raw material for what I would still regard as definitely the greatest novel of the 20th century, Life and Fate. Thank you very much indeed.
Antony Beevor. Per chi se lo volesse rivedere, il filmato è sul solito canale YouTube live stream, naturalmente, qui è andato in onda in diretta. I libri del professor Beevor e anche di Vasily Grossman sono al nostro angolo libreria. Thank you, Mr. Beevor. Thank you very much. Very interesting. Okay. Thank you.
Thanks so much.
Perfect. Thank you so much.
This guy managed to die in his tent.
He died of terrible stomach cancer, thinking that life and fate, I didn't have time to do it.
Excuse me,
Tenga, però lo rivoglio,
where is he going?
Ah, per i libri.